What the cross was endured for. The late 11th century. The world was in motion, empires were weakening, new powers were rising, and the word cross, both a religious symbol and a political slogan, united thousands. This is the story of wars whose faith mixed with politics, economy, and personal ambition. This is the history of the Crusades, from the birth of the idea to the last campaign that was supposed to decide everything. Chapter 1. Background: the shift of power and Byzantine anxiety. To understand why Europe took up arms for a holy cause at the end of the 11th century, it is important to return to Byzantine dramas. After the devastating defeat at Manzikert in 1071, Byzantium no longer felt master of Asia Minor. Turkic Muslim states formed on the horizon, controlling key passes and cities. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos found himself in a position where, like any ruler, he sought external allies. His request for aid was technically diplomatic, but culturally and politically it fell on fertile ground. In the West, the Church was looking for ways to expand its influence and for means to redirect internal nightly conflicts outward. It was precisely this combination, Byzantium's vulnerability, the papacy's mission, and the internal dynamics of Western society, that set in motion the idea of an international expedition. Alexios's plea was sincere, but the consequences exceeded any expectations. What began as a request for troops grew into a mass movement with its own logic and identity. Chapter 2. The Council of Clermont and Urban II's call. On November 27, 1095, Clermont. This was not just a religious council, it was a place where religious rhetoric and political intention merged. Pope Urban II, a figure tempered by reform struggles and the strengthening of papal authority, proclaimed to the world the idea of a crusade, to help the Eastern Christians to recover the holy places and to offer absolution to those who gave their lives in battle. Several versions of his speech have been preserved. We will probably never know the exact words, but the effect was clear. Thousands of people, from nobles to ordinary pilgrims, received it as a call of destiny. Deus vult, God wills it, became not so much a verbatim quotation as a rhetorical banner under which people moved. Clermont gave expression to several layers at once: the church hierarchy, legitimizing authority; the knightly class, an opportunity to gain land, glory, and absolution; the common people, hope for a better future, or at least an escape from poverty and powerlessness. This mixture became a time bomb. Crusades that began with high moral pomp were often governed by extremely pragmatic interests. Chapter 3. The First Crusade and the Creation of the Latin States. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, was a mixture of religious enthusiasm, adventurism, and ruthless practicality. The campaign included organized contingents of major barons, as well as popular masses led by prophets and impostors. Logistical difficulties, disease, hunger, and disagreements with Byzantium accompanied the advance through Asia Minor and Syria. Yet, in 1099, the Crusaders captured Jerusalem. That event had devastating humanitarian consequences. The mass slaughter of the civilian population after the city's capture left a deep mark on the memories of both sides. After that came a new political reality. Latin states such as the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and Edessa became Western footholds in the Levant. These entities were fragmentary by nature. heavily dependent on unstable alliances, financial support, and sea routes. They existed both as a declaration of permanence and as colonies of influence that were essentially fragile. The Crusaders brought Western legal models, knightly culture, and new trading links, but also hostility toward local communities, religious friction, and an unstable system of tenure based on the continual mobilization of resources from Europe. Chapter 4. The formation of institutions, orders, and administration. When territory needs to be held, military prowess alone is not enough. Organizations are required. The Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, and other orders emerged as answers to concrete needs, safeguarding pilgrims, fortifying the coast, and providing banking logistics for fund transfers and donations. These orders gradually became hybrids of military force, charitable organizations, and financial institutions. Their fortresses were not just walls, they were centralized nodes of power, control, and commerce. The orders' networks also created institutional memory, chronicles, statutes, rules, making them more resilient than the personal power of a single baron. The orders functioned as the bankers of their age, holding pledges, transferring capital, and issuing loans. This allowed the financing of costly campaigns and the maintenance of connections with European patrons, but also created levers of power and sources of conflict. For example, claims on resources against secular rulers. Chapter 5. Major turning points. The history of the Crusades is not only a forward march, but a sequence of decisive defeats and setbacks. The fall of Edessa, 1144, the spark that ignited a new war. Edessa was the most remote and fragile of the early Latin holdings, surrounded by Muslim lands with few knightly reinforcements and limited resources. Its establishment put it immediately in a frontier position where constant threat and diplomatic maneuvering with neighbors were the norm. Zengi, conversely, rose as a powerful military leader with ambitions to consolidate Muslim strength against the Crusaders. His interest lay not only in eliminating the Latin threat, but also in asserting his own dominance in Syria and Mosul. Zengi took advantage of the moment when Jocelyn II left with a significant portion of his troops and attacked the city in winter 1144. The siege began at the end of November and ended with the city's capture in December. His forces used standard contemporary techniques: encirclement, siege engines, sabotage, and mining beneath the walls, methods that allowed them to break through a weak defense where towers were empty or poorly guarded. Parts of the city's defense were unprepared for prolonged siege operations and ineffective in countermining. When the wall cracked, the crowd surged. The damage was enormous. Edessa's fall was the first loss of one of the original Crusader states. The event was perceived in Europe as an extraordinary threat, prompting the proclamation of the Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149. Politically, the victory strengthened Zengi's reputation as a defender of Muslim lands and set the stage for his successors, who would continue to resist Latin holdings. The Battle of Hattin, 1187, strategic catastrophe for the Crusader kingdom. By 1187, Saladin, having united Egypt and Syria, was a powerful and disciplined opponent. The Crusader kingdom was politically divided, morally exhausted, and beset by internal strife. Rainald's provocations and the loss of faith in royal authority increased the determination among Muslims to respond, while the Crusaders sought to demonstrate resolve and aim for a swift victory. This mixture, Saladin's determination and Christian errors predetermined the outcome. A crucial mistake by the Christians was marching through arid terrain where Saladin could control water sources. Saladin exploited this vulnerability. His forces blocked access to key water points, effectively depriving the Crusaders of water and the ability to reliably resupply. Chronicles describe the Crusaders suffering thirst and exhaustion. Saladin skillfully used mobile cavalry detachments and archers to disrupt formations and prepare the final blow. Christian formations proved insufficiently flexible to withstand prolonged missile fire and maneuvers when deprived of water. At the decisive moment, the Crusaders found themselves encircled at the Horns of Hattin, two volcanic hills, and surrendered as an army. Many knights were captured, a large force was destroyed or taken prisoner. Raynald was captured. He was brought before Saladin and, according to some accounts, executed, an episode that Christian brethren perceived as cruel, while Muslims considered it retribution for his raids on pilgrims. The defeat at Hattin led almost immediately to the loss of Jerusalem and a massive reassessment of the Christians' chances to retain their territories. It provoked a strong response in Europe and became the direct cause of the Third Crusade. Saladin gained political and symbolic advantage. Jerusalem was again in Muslim hands. The Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, a powerful but fragmented European response. The Third Crusade unfolded as a series of vivid but disjointed efforts, each with its own logic, heroes, and cost. In 1189, one of the main contingents, the army of Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa, moved overland through Byzantine territory in Anatolia, intending to break through to Syria with a continuous, powerful flow of troops. Fate decided this plan not on the battlefield, but on a river. In 1190, during an attempt to cross the Salif, modern Göksu, Frederick drowned. His fall into the river and the subsequent death of the emperor and many of his warriors undermined morale and combat capability, demoralized the detachments, and effectively removed one of the campaign's strongest pillars. Meanwhile, the main theater became the maritime campaign along the coast. The key episode was the Siege of Acre. This months-long siege became a test of endurance, a naval blockade, participation by Italian maritime republics, and fierce assaults on both sides made Acre the campaign's focal point. The city was strategically and logistically crucial. Controlling it meant a supply base for further operations inland and a symbolic beachhead for claims on the region. The capture of Acre by the forces of Philip II and Richard exacted a heavy toll. Assaults cost the lives of soldiers and civilians alike, and subsequent reprisals left deep wounds in collective memory. One of the most telling clashes was the Battle of Arsuf on 7th September, 1191. Here, Richard I, the Lionheart, demonstrated that disciplined knightly cavalry supported by secure maritime supply could achieve decisive tactical victories even against an experienced opponent like Saladin. Arsuf was not only a victory of Christian cavalry, it showcased logistics when seaborne supplies and reinforcements allowed the Christians to endure and counterattack. It showed the ability to hold formation and act cohesively amid difficult terrain. Nevertheless, these tactical successes did not translate into a strategic breakthrough. The main reasons were the internal disunity of the crusading leaders, Frederick's death, Philip II's early departure back to France, and Richard's limited resources. as well as objective logistical difficulties and the need to maintain a permanent base on the continent. As a result, despite taking Acre and winning at Arsuf, the Christian coalition lacked the foothold necessary to undertake a decisive assault on Jerusalem and to hold conquered territories in the long term. The climax was a politico-military compromise. In 1192, exhausted by expenses and losses, Richard and Saladin reached an agreement. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, but the agreement guaranteed Christians access to holy places and safe passage for pilgrims and merchants, a pragmatic peace born of mutual fatigue and the need to save face. Richard returned home in October 1192, leaving the region in a state of truce, but not in a condition to restore previous Christian dominion. The Third Crusade stands as a symbol of the era precisely because of the combination of great tactical victories and strategic deficiency. Political will, resources, and unity were lacking. It showed that knightly exploits and glory alone were insufficient to resolve long-standing geopolitical problems. Why the Third Crusade failed to retake Jerusalem? Disunity of leaders, rivalry among Frederick, Philip, and Richard, fragmented efforts, logistics, and local forces. Control of the coast was restored, but without a sustainable economic and political base on the mainland, retaking Jerusalem was risky. Tactical victories versus strategic objectives. Arsuf and Acre were large tactical successes, but not a total strategic reversal. Both sides ultimately exhausted their resources. Chapter 6. Crisis and Transformation. The Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204. The Fourth Crusade is not simply another military expedition of the 11th to 13th centuries. It is an instance where financial interests, diplomatic intrigues, and selfish ambitions converged so that an army originally gathered to liberate Jerusalem ended up attacking a Christian city and sacking the greatest capital of Eastern Christendom, Constantinople. This event became a turning point. The crusading ideal was transformed into an instrument of internal politics and commercial interests. Its consequences were felt for centuries. The crusade had been proclaimed by Pope Innocent III with the aim of recovering Jerusalem. However, organizing the expedition required a sizable fleet, and the Franco-Norman knights turned to Venice for transport. When agreeing on the construction and hire of ships, the parties arrived at a massive sum that the Crusaders could not fully pay. The Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, proposed a solution. In return for part of the payment, he requested help in resolving Venice's own interests, and he proposed to use the Crusaders' forces to achieve Venetian objectives. Ultimately, debt, Venice's commercial aims, and the Crusade leaders' political weakness became the mechanism that redirected the expedition toward the Adriatic and then toward Constantinople. After the capture of Constantinople, a massive redistribution operation began. Precious relics, golden icons, sacred objects, and architectural ornaments fell into the hands of the victors. A significant portion of the treasures was shipped to Venice. This strengthened the Republic economically and culturally in the region. Other spoils were divided among leading Crusader nobles. The export of Byzantine relics to Western Europe had a powerful symbolic effect and opened a flow of artistic and religious objects that influenced Western culture. The Crusade betrayed its original ideal, the liberation of Palestine, and showed how easily sacred rhetoric could be exploited for secular ends. The papacy found itself in a situation where formal blessing of the expedition could not guarantee moral purity of actions by participants acting far from Rome. For many contemporaries and later generations, the Fourth Crusade was a disgrace, a symbol of how religious war could be transformed into an instrument of greed and politics. Chapter 7. Expansion of the cross idea. Reconquista, the Baltic, the Albigensians. The idea of the crusade proved much more flexible than many suppose. What was initially conceived as a path to liberate the Holy Land gradually turned into a universal instrument, a tool of policy, colonization, and even internal cleansing. In this chapter, we examine three applications of the same formula: the Reconquista on the Iberian Peninsula, the Northern or Baltic Crusades, and the Albigensian Crusade in France. Three theaters, three logics, one rhetoric. The Reconquista is not a single event or a single century. It is a multi-century process, from early raids to the conclusion in the 15th century. But for our narrative, the key meaning lies in transformation. The Reconquista shows how the cross became a justification for systematic expansion. It combined hunger for land with religious legitimation. After the collapse of the Umayyad Caliphate on the Iberian Peninsula, taifas, local Muslim principalities, appeared. Christian kingdoms in the north, Castile, Leon, Aragon, and later Portugal, gradually grew stronger and began pushing Muslims to the south. Military techniques here were multi-staged, from seasonal raids to systematic sieges and a policy of repopulation, resettling newly captured territories with Christian communities. Military orders, Santiago, Calatrava, and others, became not just military forces, but agents of colonization. They built castles, settled colonists, and established administrative frameworks. A key moment was the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212. This victory over the Almohads substantially weakened Muslim forces and opened the way for further conquests by Castile and its allies. The political outcome of the Reconquista was the emergence of strong centralized kingdoms: Castile, Aragon, Portugal. Economically, the development of new lands, agricultural growth, and increased trade. Culturally, a complex interaction, architecture, crafts, linguistic borrowings. But at the root lay one principle. When the cross is employed for conquest, it legitimizes practical aims, from land to power. In the north, the cross was applied to peoples whom Western Europe labeled pagans: the Prussians, Livonians, Latgalians, and others who lived along the Baltic shores. Missionary activity rapidly turned into conquest and colonization. The engine was the German Knights, first the Brothers of the Sword, then the powerful Teutonic Order. Danes and Swedes also participated, and the Hanseatic trade network operated in the rear. Participants were attracted by land, revenue, and influence. The Pope equated participation in these campaigns with indulgences, which made them attractive to knights and ordinary Christians alike. The methods were castles, colonization, and administrative networks. The order built fortresses around which settlers clustered. From the castle came governance, tax collection, and local administration. Thus, a state within a state emerged, the Teutonic Order in Prussia, with its own laws and economy. These campaigns led to prolonged confrontation with Lithuania and the Rusas principalities. A famous episode is the Battle on the Ice of 1242 on Lake Peipus, where Allied Rusas forces halted the Teutonic advance. Later, in 1410, the Battle of Grunwald inflicted a severe blow on the Teutonic Order, a sign that the order's expansion would eventually meet large-scale resistance. In the long run, the Baltic was Christianized and significantly Germanized. The price was centuries of conflict, cultural transformation, and new geopolitical lines that persisted beyond the Middle Ages. The Albigensian Crusade is an example of applying the cross within Christian Europe. In the early 13th century, the papacy and northern French nobility joined against the Cathars, a religious movement in southern France deemed heretical by the Church. In 1209, the campaign began, and its first notorious episode was the sack of Béziers. Crusaders brutally massacred the city. Chronicles report horrific scenes and the phrase attributed later, "Kill them all, God will know his own." This event became symbolic. The cross was now used to suppress internal opponents and to redistribute wealthy southern lands to northern barons. What followed were sieges, appointments of vassals, and confiscations. Simon de Montfort and his followers effectively transplanted northern feudal structures into the Languedoc. The Inquisition, established later, cemented ideological control. The fight against heresy took on bureaucratic and judicial forms. The political result was the gradual incorporation of Languedoc into the orbit of the French crown, the strengthening of central authority, and the loss of local autonomy. Cultural damage was no less significant. Language, customs, and local nobility suffered serious blows. What unites these three lines? The answer is simple and alarming. The rhetoric of a holy mission proved to be a universal tool, serving various interests. Sometimes it was genuine missionary and colonizing activity, sometimes pure political expansion, sometimes internal repression. The historical moral is ambiguous. On one hand, these processes accelerated the formation of modern states. On the other, they caused violence, loss of cultures, and human suffering. Chapter 8. Final attempts to retake the East, Louis IX and subsequent expeditions. Brief introduction: who Louis IX was and why he went on crusade. Louis IX, later called Saint Louis, was not a typical knight adventurer. He was a deeply religious yet pragmatic administrator, a man who thought about law and justice but was willing to spend the royal treasury on a holy cause. His campaigns were not episodes of mindless belligerence, but targeted projects by a monarch who believed that he would personally lead church and crown to the fulfillment of Christian duty. The decision to strike at Egypt, 7th Crusade, and later to land in Tunisia, 8th Crusade, reflected the combination of sincere faith, political logic, and a desire to leave a meaningful legacy. Motivation and preparation for the 7th Crusade. By the early 1240 SC, the Christian position in the East looked precarious. Jerusalem had not been held securely, and Muslim forces were consolidating, pushing Latin strongholds back. In 1244, Jerusalem again fell from Christian hands, and the papacy at the First Council of Lyon, 1245, backed the idea of a new crusade. Louis, pressured by religious opinion and his own convictions, took the cross. The preparations were royal in scale. Finances were marshaled, troops assembled, and commanders appointed, including Louis's brothers, the military orders, and numerous barons. The strategic target chosen was not direct march on Jerusalem, but a strike at Egypt. The logic was clear. Egypt was the resourceful military center controlling access to the Holy Land. Landing in Egypt and the capture of Damietta, 1249. Operational details. A fleet sailed from Provençal and Marseille ports and landed in the Nile Delta. In June 1249, the Crusaders captured Damietta, a huge success that looked like the start of a decisive campaign. Tactically, this secured a supply base on the coast and the ability to control river communications. However, holding and advancing through the delta required precise logistics. Water, boats, sturdy pontoon crossings, and the ability to operate in swampy, canalized terrain, all of which proved critically important. Early successes were marred by long waits for reinforcements, weather and sanitary problems, and the death of rivals within the Egyptian leadership, which created a political vacuum and mobilized opposition to the invaders. Battles at Al-Mansura and the enemy's tactics, a trap, and the shift of initiative. A key episode was the fighting around Al-Mansura. Attempts by the Crusaders to penetrate farther inland led to a series of clashes. Egyptian forces, including newly activated Mamluk detachments and local commanders, used flexible mobile tactics. They knew the terrain, controlled water sources and canal crossings, struck with light cavalry to inflict attrition, and burned communications. Western knightly formations excelled in open-field engagements and sieges, but were vulnerable in urban traps and maneuvers in deltaic terrain. At Al-Mansura, the Crusaders were caught in a trap. Retreating into the city, they were pressed and suffered heavy losses. Among the dead was Robert of Artois, a notable leader of the expedition. This episode demonstrated the rise of a new force on the scene. The key figures of the Mamluks were beginning to play a decisive role. The Battle of Fariskour and Louis' capture, April 1250. How to lose after success, after failure and heavy losses, the Crusaders retreated to Damietta. Pursuit and a running action ended in the Battle of Fariskour. There, as a result of encirclement and exhaustion, the army was routed and King Louis IX was captured. According to chronicles, the capture was relatively honorable. The king was kept in reasonable conditions, but a huge ransom was demanded along with the return of Damietta. Following negotiations, France paid the ransom and handed Damietta over in exchange for Louis' release and that of his companions. This was a strategic defeat that cost a great deal and lost the initiative. Consequences of the Seventh Crusade for the crusading cause and for France. The results were painful. Material losses, a blow to the king's prestige, and the weakening of the crusading myth as a guaranteed solution to the Jerusalem question. However, Louis' personal reputation remained strong. His conduct in captivity, his pleas for clemency for prisoners, and his subsequent dedication to religious and reformist practices reinforced his image as a saintly monarch in France and Europe. From a military history standpoint, the Seventh Crusade showed that a large raid in the climatically and geographically specific environment of Egypt without a strong base in logistics is fraught with risk. Furthermore, the rise of the Mamluks in Egypt, who would soon form their own dynasty, made them the main adversary of Latin holdings. The rise of the Mamluks, the Eighth Crusade, why again and why Tunisia? 20 years later, Louis again decided to march under the cross. Reasons were complex, a combination of personal piety, diplomatic ambitions, and the idea that North Africa might provide a base to support operations in the Levant. He gathered forces and landed in Tunisia in the summer of 1270. But this time, the problem was not fierce resistance, but disease. Summer heat, poor sanitation, contaminated water, and likely scurvy and dysentery soon struck the army. Louis himself fell ill and died on August 25th, or 26th, 1270. After his death, the campaign was abandoned, his brother Charles arranged for an orderly evacuation of the army and returned to Europe. Louis's death effectively closed the era of monarch-led crusading at the level of the King of France. Political and spiritual outcomes, Louis's image and the lessons of an era Louis remained in Europe's memory as a martyr king. Canonized in 1297, he became a model of the holy ruler. Yet, his campaigns and their failures teach important lessons. Religious motivation does not exempt one from the need for military science. Personal heroism does not replace institutional capacity. Climate and disease can determine the fate of a campaign faster than the sword. Geopolitically, the defeats in Egypt and the diplomatic failure in Tunisia strengthened local rulers, the Mamluks in Egypt and the Hafsids in Tunisia, and largely predetermined that direct European attempts to retake Jerusalem would become rare and increasingly symbolic. Chapter 9. The Ninth Crusade is often called the last echo of the Great Crusading era, but by the time it began, the flame of those campaigns had long since burned down, leaving only glowing embers. It was led by the English Prince Edward, the future King Edward I Longshanks. The expedition set out in 1271, at a time when the political map of the Near East had radically changed and the notion of crusading was undergoing a deep crisis. By then, the Holy Land had been shaken by new forces. To the east, the Mongol power was on the rise, and in the Muslim world, a strong Mamluk power was taking shape under Sultan Baybars, a talented commander and ruthless opponent of the Christian states of the Eastern Mediterranean. Baybars had already destroyed the Principality of Antioch, weakened the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and driven the Franks from most fortresses. In this context, Edward's expedition looked more like a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable collapse than a coherent strategy. Edward arrived in Acre in 1271 with a relatively small force, roughly 1,000 knights and soldiers. His forces could not compare to the armies of the early Crusades, but he hoped for an alliance with the Mongols, who were hostile to the Mamluks. Negotiations did take place, and the Mongols even conducted raids into Muslim-held Syria, but that operation proved too limited to change the situation. Edward's military actions were characterized by quick raids and shows of force. He struck at the environs of Acre, tried to destabilize Mamluk positions, but could not undertake large sieges or deep incursions into enemy territory. His campaign mainly served to bolster the morale of remaining Christian garrisons rather than to fundamentally change the balance of power. One notable episode was an assassination attempt on Edward. A Muslim killer, reportedly associated with the Nizari Ismailis, infiltrated the camp and inflicted a wound with a poisoned blade. Edward survived, but his recovery took time, weakening his expeditionary activity even further. In 1272, having learned of his father Henry III's death, Edward ended the campaign and returned to England to claim the throne. The Ninth Crusade ended without tangible military success. It failed to prevent the fall of the remaining Christian possessions in the region. 19 years later, in 1291, Acre, the last major bastion of the Crusaders in the Holy Land, fell to the Mamluks, finally bringing the era to a close. The Ninth Crusade symbolizes the decline of the crusading movement. It showed that without a powerful coalition, reliable logistics, and substantial resources, holding positions in the East was impossible. What had seemed in the 12th century to be a matter for the whole Christian world had, by the late 13th century, become a series of localized expeditions where each side acted more in its own interest than for a common cause. Edward returned home not as a victor, but as a witness to the end of an era. Chapter 10. The Fall of Acre in 1291 was not merely a military defeat, but the symbolic end of a nearly two-century epic. For Europe, it was a blow comparable to the loss of Jerusalem itself. For the Muslim East, it was the final confirmation of control over the Levantine coasts. By the late 13th century, the Kingdom of Jerusalem existed only nominally. Its capital was Acre, a major port city that had become the Crusader stronghold after the loss of inland Palestine. Acre was ringed by powerful walls and towers, and its harbor received ships from Genoa, Venice, and other maritime republics. The city was not only a military fortress, but also a center of trade, diplomacy, and espionage between East and West. Opposing them was the Sultan of Egypt and Syria al-Ashraf Khalil, son of Baibars, who inherited his resolve and experience. By 1290, the Mamluks were stronger than ever, a disciplined army, vast resources, experience in sieges, and a clear understanding that destroying the last Crusader base was essential to eliminating the threat. The pretext for war was the killing of Muslim merchants in Acre by Christians. The incident may have been accidental, but Khalil used it as diplomatic justification to begin the siege. In the spring of 1291, a Mamluk army numbering tens of thousands surrounded the city. Among them were foot archers, heavy cavalry, and skilled engineers adept with siege engines. The siege was merciless. The Mamluks constantly battered the walls with catapults, dug tunnels beneath them, and sought to collapse the fortifications. The Crusaders, including the Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, and contingents from Italian cities, defended desperately. For a time, they repelled assaults, but the forces were overwhelmingly unequal. On May 18, 1291, the Mamluks breached the defenses. Fierce street fighting broke out. The Templars sheltered in their fortress and fought to the last, but it too soon fell. The city was pillaged, many inhabitants were killed, and survivors were taken into slavery. For the Muslims, it was a definitive victory. For Europe, it was bitter news signaling the irrevocable loss of the Holy Land. The fall of Acre not only ended the Eastern crusading era, but was a powerful psychological blow. After 1,291 attempts to reclaim lost territories were isolated and uncoordinated, lacking the scope of earlier campaigns. Europe turned its energies toward internal conflicts, commercial rivalries, and struggles for power. From that moment, the Levant was permanently out of Christian control. Caravans of merchants, diplomats, and mercenaries replaced the great Crusader armies. Although the idea of holy war did not vanish, it no longer retained the force it had during the early Crusades. Acre faded not only into the sands of time, but also from the European worldview as the last bastion that fell to a new era. Chapter 11. Over nearly 2 centuries, the Crusades left a deep mark on the history of Europe and the Near East, changing not only political maps, but the destinies of whole peoples. Although the military goal, establishing Christian control over Jerusalem and the Holy Land, was never permanently achieved, the consequences of the Crusades proved far more complex and extensive than a simple division between winners and losers. For Europe, the Crusades became a catalyst for change. They strengthened monarchies, undermining the influence of feudal lords whose knights fought abroad for years. The campaigns fortified trade links with the East. Spices, silk, gems, technologies, and even new agricultural crops penetrated Europe. This altered tastes, daily life, and the economy, and in the long term contributed to the rise of towns and the emergence of early capitalism. The Crusader states, albeit short-lived, became places of unique cultural exchange. In Palestine, Syria, and Cyprus Latin, Byzantine and Arabic traditions intertwined, producing distinctive architecture, military techniques, and domestic customs. Europeans adopted Muslim methods of fortification, medical knowledge, and navigation skills. But the Crusades had a dark side. Religious fanaticism led to an increase in intolerance, mass pogroms against Jewish communities in Europe, murders of Muslims, and the destruction of Byzantium during the Fourth Crusade were grim reminders that atrocities were committed under the banner of the cross. These actions left deep scars in interreligious relations that persist for centuries. For the Muslim world, the Crusades provoked military consolidation. Baibars, Saladin, and other leaders turned resistance into a unifying symbol, strengthening political centers in Egypt and Syria. Victories over Western knights entered cultural memory and reinforced the idea of resisting foreign incursions. On a spiritual level, the idea of the cross underwent transformation. If, in the 11th to 12th centuries, the Crusade represented an enterprise of pan-Christian Europe, by the 14th century it had become a symbol of the political interests of individual rulers, an instrument of papal influence, and even a justification for conquests in other regions, whether the Reconquista in Spain, wars in the Baltic, or suppression of the heretics in Europe. The main legacy of the Crusades is not battlefield victories or defeats, but the vast interaction of two worlds, a clash of civilizations that produced both knowledge exchange and long-standing enmity. The Crusades showed that even under the banner of a single faith, Europe could act in a fragmented manner, and that religious zeal often gave way to political and economic interests. By the fall of Acre and the end of the Ninth Crusade, the crusading idea had ceased to function as a powerful unifying force, but its memory remained in songs and chronicles, in Gothic cathedrals, on the pages of chivalric romances, and in political rhetoric. Perhaps it is this memory, rather than the conquests themselves, that has become the Crusades' most enduring legacy. Epilogue, a logical finale and the last campaign as a symbol. The era of the Crusades began with a call for holy war meant to unite the Christian world for a great purpose. It ended in a quiet fading when the Last Crusade became more of a symbol than a real military campaign. The Last Campaign is not only the story of specific battles and political intrigues, but an image combining faith, ambition, tragedy, and the hopes of an entire generation. It symbolizes how ideals can be transformed under the pressure of reality. The first Crusaders went to the Holy Land inspired by promises of salvation and sanctity of their cause. But after 2 centuries, the cross ceased to be a sign of unity. It became a banner used for political gain, commercial advantage, or personal glory. Both bitterness and grandeur in this symbol. Bitterness, because no crusade succeeded in securing the Holy Land permanently for Christians. Grandeur, because these were unprecedented in scale for their time, uniting thousands from many lands in a common enterprise, albeit one doomed to failure. The Last Campaign reminds us that any idea, however lofty, can be distorted by politics and ambition, but it also shows that faith and determination can mobilize people to cross oceans and mountains, to meet other cultures, to discover new worlds, even if the outcome falls short of hope. The history of the Crusades is not merely a chronicle of wars, but a mirror of human nature. In it, we see both light and darkness, and the eternal striving for what seems unattainable. Thank you for traveling this path with me, from Urban II's first calls to the fall of Acre and the symbolic last campaign. History does not end as long as we remember it. Farewell, and see you again.